Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about facts as something that goes to the heart of what it means for us to keep our democracies, to challenge authoritarianism, challenge Putinism, and we're going to distinguish facts from other ways of making sense of the world, and do so via 6 propositions I've jotted down about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, starting from the most blankly factual and ending with the richest and most normative proposition. Now, you might already say, well, what are you talking about, Vlad? You completely lost the plot. You're going to talk to us about facts. I mean, I have 3 limes in my fridge and 4 lemons, and what are you going to tell us? That 3 is not 3, that it's 6, and that's controversial? That lime isn't a lime, and it could be a lemon on a different day. Facts are facts. There's nothing interesting to discuss. And when Clemenceau was meeting German diplomats in the run-up to Versailles, they asked him what he thought future historians would make of the First World War. And he said, well, they're not going to say that Belgium invaded Germany. So fact, what's there to talk about? There is a lot to talk about in a society in which we are not just in separate mental worlds, but we're increasingly in separate fact worlds, in separate fact bubbles, right? And we find ourselves in separate fact bubbles at a time when, back to the main channel video from a couple of days ago, our democracies are wonky and our authoritarian challenges coming from different parts of the world are serious. So what I'm going to do, if you permit me, is make a 3-way distinction. And distinction sounds like it's a word that belongs on the philosophy channel, but it isn't. It's really stuff that goes to the heart of our democratic life. I'm going to make a 3-way distinction between factual claims about the world, evaluative or interpretive claims about the world, secondly, and thirdly, normative claims about how the world should or shouldn't go. And after I make that distinction, I'm going to jump to 6 propositions about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And after, I want to say something about how I use the label a fact. And that won't be as a recommendation to you, because of course I'm doing that in my capacity as a public intellectual, and in a different capacity you might adopt a different policy. But I think it'll be very helpful to share how I do it, because how I do it is based on concerns about where our politics is at, really. And then after that, I'll say something about a very important but very flawed institution in our polities, an institution that's in crisis, in fact. That's this institution of fact-checking. So, at first, making sense of the world in terms of facts, in terms of evaluations, and in terms of normativity. Each of these 3 categories can be flatter or richer. You can have a very flat fact, or you can have a very rich fact. The king was assassinated. Might be a rich fact because it might contain more presuppositions than a man died. In case there's any dispute about how he died, in case there is any dispute about whether he is the king or whether he is legitimately the king, right? So they're both claims that we would call factual, but one of these factual claims requires more presuppositions and veers toward the domain of the interpretive. Now, an interpretive claim might then be the king was assassinated by a revolutionary group whose inception was triggered by extremities of poverty and social disadvantage in society X. So we haven't yet said anything about whether what happened is good or whether what happened is bad. We've just made an interpretation about what it was that happened and how it happened. Right? That's an evaluative and interpretive claim. And here's something very difficult to admit needs to be admitted, and that's that interpretation about the world, saying the sort of thing I've said, or the sort of thing I constantly say about, let's say, our democracies, when I say that our democracies are in decline, or the sorts of things I say about the Kremlin, that they're on a kind of escalation pattern. These are interpretations. And what's difficult about interpretations, what's hard to swallow with our meritocratic instincts, is that they're based on insight, and insight comes in superior and inferior forms, which is to say, you might have a conversation about that king who was taken out, with Helen having a perspective on it, and Susan having a perspective on it. But the difference might be that Susan can see her own perspective and Helen's perspective, whereas Helen can only see her own perspective. Susan has two, Helen has one. Susan is in a hermeneutically, interpretively, evaluatively, whatever label you want to use, superior position to Helen. And, in fact, when Susan makes arguments about what really happened, if Susan is genuinely more insightful and right about this, then it might be that Helen will not be able to see the purchase of Susan's arguments. Because, as it were, they are only things that could be seen from the superior position that Susan occupies. Superior in terms of insight relative to Helen. Such that getting the point about what happened, right, might be hard for Helen if she can't see it. And so the fact that Susan's in superior position is only a point that's graspable if you are already in the superior position. And if you are not, it might not be graspable. Right? So there are these differences of insight. And then we move from the evaluative to the normative, and here, of course, there are also differences of insight. But here we're in the realm of talking about what makes the world go better or worse. Now let's jump to 6 propositions about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, starting from the most flatly factual, going into the evaluative second, and then third into the normative realm. Claim 1. 2 armies are fighting in Eastern Europe. That's an extremely flat factual claim. It carries very few presuppositions, and I doubt anybody would challenge it. I mean, there is absolutely no reason for Zelensky or Putin to disagree with this. Well, let's get a little bit richer. Let's state a factual claim that has more presuppositions. Russian soldiers advanced into territory internationally recognized as Ukraine. It's still trying to keep things minimal. It's not saying Ukraine is real, because that would trigger Putin, right? It's a factually minimal claim in that respect. And it says advanced into territory. So it's also trying to stay neutral on the issue of whether Putin was already invading Ukraine, as we indeed believe he was, but that's not the point. The point is keeping our factual claim minimal here. But saying he advanced further suggests that he may have already been invading Ukraine before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Well then, let's now get more factually rich and make a factual claim that requires more presuppositions. Russia invaded Ukraine, number 3. Well, to us, that's completely apparent, and I think every single person watching this would agree, and Putin would probably agree, but I think there's a part of him that might want to say, well, how can I invade something that doesn't exist? Ukraine isn't real. They're just Russians who've forgotten they're Russians and been brainwashed by malign US imperial interference. Well, now let's make a fourth claim, which takes us into the domain of the interpretive. Russia invaded Ukraine imperialistically. And again, this is a view that I recommend, but it's no longer a factual view. It's not even a richly factual view. It's an evaluation. And in fact, there could be somebody who is as opposed to Putin's invasion of Ukraine as anybody in the world could be, and still reject this description, because they might say, well, look, precisely the nature of Russia's genocidal rhetoric about Ukraine shows that it's not an imperialistic invasion, because the rhetoric is about how Ukraine doesn't exist, because Ukraine's just Russia. Ukraine is just forgetfully Russia, according to that genocidal rhetoric. And therefore, Ukraine isn't being treated like a colony, like some kind of other who needs to be civilized. If you want to see Russian imperialism, have a look elsewhere, have a look in Chechnya. But Ukraine is a ghastly, brutal invasion backed by genocidal rhetoric, but it's not imperialistic in the conventional sense. So I contest this, right? I don't recommend that contestation. I think that the word imperialistic applies even if you admit that interesting observation about the nature of Putin's and the Kremlin's rhetoric about Ukraine. But nevertheless, no, we're here in the realm of the evaluative now. Well, let's begin transitioning from the realm of the evaluative to the realm of the normative. Number 5. Russia brutally invaded Ukraine. You see, you could just about tell a story about a justified brutal invasion. So it still is, if you like, to the lower end of where we might normatively go, but we're already in the realm of not just the interpretive, but the normative, because brutally kind of implies that it's not a good thing. 6. Here we're in thoroughgoing normativity. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is ethically or politically unacceptable. Right? We're just saying, this is bad. Now, having made this distinction between the factual, the evaluative, and the normative via this 6-point step, let me make a couple of quick remarks, and then I'll say a few things about how I use this distinction. I'll say just 2 things about how I use this 3-way distinction. Then I'll say something about the institution of fact-checking. But first, 2 quick remarks. If you are choosing to use facts more flatly than you could choose to use them, right? If you say, look, anything that's a richer fact, I'm going to be conservative about calling it a fact anymore. I'm going to perhaps call it an evaluation. And instead, I'm going to reserve the term fact for the flattest facts. That is itself an evaluatively or interpretively driven choice, right? So if you favor minimalism in factuality, right, that's itself an evaluative approach. And the other observation I wanted to make is that, of course, it's possible to give an untruthful evaluation while getting every single fact right. So let's now say something about how I personally use this 3-way distinction, particularly when it comes to matters of fact. And this does not come as advice to you, because I'm talking about my usage and my capacity as a public intellectual. So it's not advice, it's an illustration of my usage that I think is beneficial to have a look at sideways. I love to keep what I call a fact really minimal. And therefore avoid calling what we've just labeled richer facts facts in the way I engage. And that's important because it just gets through better that way when you live in a culture that is siloed out into different mental worlds and different distinct fact worlds that struggle to communicate with each other. Which isn't to say I don't go around saying this and that and that and this is stuff we should really agree on before we say anything else. I do go on saying that, but I call that minimal interpretations. So let's take an example. It's obvious that there's a terroristic component to the way Russia has bombed Ukraine. That's to say, it's not just that they are not it's not just that the Russians are failing to minimize civilian casualties. It's that under certain circumstances they know and act on the idea that maximizing them is kind of conducive to their aims. There's a terroristic element there, which is worse than just not trying to kill civilians and being very casual about hitting targets where there are going to be a lot of civilians. That's to say, giving up on the idea of intending not to kill. So it's not just that, it's worse than that. There's a terroristic aspect there. But I would never say that that's a fact about what the Russians are doing. Somebody else might easily, Tim Snyder might easily speak as though it's sort of a fact about what the Russians are up to. And I'd want to say, yeah, they're doing it. But when I say they're doing it, I'm not calling that a fact. I'm calling that an interpretation. I'm calling it an objectively correct interpretation, but it's absolutely an interpretation, right? And if I'm going to call anything about the way Russians are bombing Ukraine a fact, I'm going to try to make that as minimal as possible in a way that really tries to stay out of the meanings of the actions of the Russians and just looking at the, if you like, at the brute, blunt factuality of their actions taken narrowly, right? Have they bombed Odessa? Have they not? Fact, not fact, right? So it's not a sharp and hard sort of rule, but I like to keep what I call a fact minimal. But over and above that, I do like to be bullish on minimal interpretations. So that's to say, I am not here to tell you what to think or what to feel. I'm here to help you explore what you think and what you feel. And I'm here to look at you with process, via process. So the process of how we come to respond to the political and cultural world around us. And then the process of exploring that process. That's to say that we always keep coming back. We never do 15 minutes and then cut off. The very point of everything we're doing together is that we're going to be back. We hope. You never know. The world is a fragile place, but and life is a fragile place. But the point is, we're trying to create a space where there is the possibility to be back and the possibility to be back. And what's key about our conversation is this business of returning to the same room for tea and then continuing to engage. That goes to the heart of my culture of public intellectual engagement. But nevertheless, there are some minimal things that I recommend. And I don't shy away from saying that they are interpretations that I just insist on. An example might be the latest state of climate science. I just don't want to debate that. If you don't think that the latest form of climate science is roughly where I think it's at, I'm just going to simply recommend that you think again. And I'm going to make that recommendation strongly. Whereas with a richer evaluation, I'm actually going to be strong in telling you my interpretation, right? Because that's what you're here for. But I'm not going to be strong in sort of recommending you to think it, whatever else is true about you. Because on that, I'm going to say, well, no, you've got to come to stuff your own way, in a way that is distinctively percolated through your experience, through your personality, through your own values and concerns. And so this business of an interpretation imposed on you from a top doesn't make sense to me. So when I give an interpretation, I spend half an hour sitting here describing something, evaluating then something, that's not with the point that you should immediately adopt it. It's with the point that you should benefit from witnessing that process and then make something of it, right? But that's open-ended. But then with the narrow interpretations, with the thinner, flatter interpretations, I want to say, hey, I do recommend you think this, whether you're a Marxist, whether you're a conservative, and we are both watching this. I just recommend it. I just recommend it, you know. So these are things that I call minimal interpretations, but I still wouldn't call them facts. So, for example, lots of people are overheating now about the extraordinary destruction of life in Gaza, right? And whatever you say about how many non-combatants the IDF is killing in Gaza, I want to say that an accurate description of the approach of the IDF, which I've given statements about in other videos, is not a factual matter. It's an interpretive matter. It's an interpretive matter. So, and I might be bullish on it, but I'm not going to call it a matter of fact. Now, lastly, I just want to say something about the institution of fact-checking in our culture. And you know about that institution. I mean, there's hardly a journalistic institution that doesn't engage in the practice of fact-checking. The New York Times does it, the BBC does it, everybody does it. And my personal assessment is a kind of grave one at the moment, and that's that this institution is in crisis. And it's one of the institutions that is at the core of the raging collapse in public trust that we're living through in the West. And so, to some extent, it's just inevitable that the institution of fact-checking would be in that kind of crisis. But to some extent, it's a self-created problem. Because what's happened with the institution of fact-checking is that it's sprawled out from flat facts to richer facts that require more presuppositions, to, quite frankly, what are interpretations, you know? And I myself have, on several occasions, noticed major journalistic institutions fact-checking what is supposed to be disinformation on YouTube, for example, and getting their fact check 70% right, which is a catastrophe. So that's already my second point about the institution of fact-checking. My first point, by implication, of course, is that if you're doing a fact check, you have got to keep it down to minimal facts. Minimal facts. You cannot fact check somebody on YouTube who claims that Barack Obama is secretly planning to undermine American democracy. You can't fact check that. You can fact check whether Obama traveled to China on a certain date. You can fact check potentially how much Obama got paid for a certain speech. You could fact check how tall Obama is. You could fact check where he is born. But you can't fact check some deranged claim about Barack Obama that says that he is some kind of demonic traitor. Now, nor can you really fact check whether something is racist. And you see now where I'm going with this. So fact checking has to be done, number one, as flatly as possible. How many bombs did Israel drop on Gaza? How many Israeli civilians died? How many civilians in Gaza died? How many planes does Israel have? These are things you can fact check. You cannot fact check whether ethnic cleansing is happening, I'm afraid. You can fact check at a push whether certain things meet a certain criteria of ethnic cleansing, although even that is already a stretch. You cannot fact check if a war crime is happening. You can fact check at a stretch whether a certain definition of a war crime is being met. But even here, we're already in worrying waters. And I don't want to put a red light here and say that's an absolute no-no, but I want to tendentiously say that the institution of fact-checking has to err on the side of minimalism, that you're going to check minimal facts, the flatter kinds of facts. Of course, you've got to check them with due process. And that's important because the cost of getting a fact check wrong is really high, to the point that it's better not to do it. And one of the problems, and I think it may be improving now, but we've got to see how it goes. One of the problems, in my judgment, with some of the fact checks that appeared on the BBC website over recent years is that in an organization with extraordinary journalistic capacity that has teams of people, some of the best professionals in the world, investigating a question over a course of a year and a half, right? Top level professionals have been all over the world, know what they're doing. But next to that, you sometimes have seemingly junior staff producing some kind of article on the website that is called fact-checking, which does not remotely represent the BBC's best work. Fact-checking is not something you can do on the side. Your best work has to go into it, or you don't do it at all, right? Because the loss of legitimacy that you experience as an institution from doing a wrong fact check, and the wrong fact check is a 90% right fact check, is really, really catastrophic. I mean, and I have in mind several fact checks that journalistic institutions did, which they got mostly right, but partly wrong. And imagine you're fact checking some lunatic on the internet who is mostly saying strange things. And imagine you're only 80% right in your fact check. Imagine what equalization you create between yourself and the lunatic through that overreach, you know? let's say you went beyond the factual. And here there's a real danger of inserting into fact checks ideologies of progress. And that's a very, 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 very dangerous thing. Fact checking has nothing to do with who you think is bad and who you think is good. Fact checking, at least in terms of what the paradigm for it is as an institution, is, did Barack Obama go to China? Did he not? So, one of the things that's coming out of this chat is a very soft recommendation to you, but a harder recommendation to public intellectuals and a very hard recommendation to fact checkers to use the term fact more minimally, which doesn't restrict you from going around saying, come on, that and this is right. What it restricts you from is saying this is that and this is right because it's a fact. There's plenty of things that I think are absolutely strikingly and overwhelmingly and clearly right that aren't facts. So, and that, of course, if you're a fact-checking institution, requires seriousness, due process, and high-quality resources being put into this. That's enough of a rant for today. Lots of love and talk soon.